The moment Elara Voss stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and every soul on that dusty Main Street looked up and knew what was coming. She had traveled 3 days from St. Louis with 2 traveling cases, a carpetbag stuffed with books and correspondence, and one enormous steamer trunk that held everything she owned in the world worth keeping: her mother's china, her father's surveying maps, 3 dresses that were entirely too fine for a frontier town, and the wooden music box her grandmother had carried over from Bremen 40 years before. The trunk was the problem. It was heavy enough that 2 dock workers back in St. Louis had grunted and complained when loading it onto the coach, and now it sat on the edge of the boardwalk like an obstacle nobody wanted to claim responsibility for. The wind had already picked up something fierce. It came rolling across the open prairie from the southwest, carrying with it the smell of rain and something darker underneath, that electric, mineral sharpness that old-timers called storm breath. Pieces of newspaper skidded along the street. A woman across the road grabbed her bonnet with both hands. The horses tied to the rail outside Dawson's General Store stamped and pulled at their reins, their ears pinned back flat. Elara stood beside her trunk and tried to look composed. She was 24 years old, newly widowed after only 7 months of marriage, and she had come to Caldwell because her late husband, Thomas Voss, had owned a small piece of property on the edge of town, a house and a parcel of land that were now hers, that she had never seen, that she was not entirely sure she wanted, but that represented the only solid thing in a life that had recently been shaken apart at every seam. She was not the kind of woman who cried in public. She had cried plenty in private, on the long train ride west from St. Louis, pressing her face against the cool glass of the window and watching the world flatten out into endless grass. But she had put all of that away before stepping off the coach, tucking it somewhere deep and quiet inside herself, because she understood that arriving in a new place with red eyes was an invitation for strangers to pity you, and she wanted no one's pity. What she wanted was simply to get her trunk to her house before that enormous black sky opened up and ruined everything inside it. The stagecoach driver, a compact red-faced man named Hortle who had spoken approximately 14 words to her across 3 days of travel, had set her luggage on the boardwalk and was already climbing back up to his seat. The station hand, a boy of perhaps 14, had loaded her smaller bags onto a small wooden cart without being asked, which was kind, but the cart was too small for the trunk, and the boy clearly had no idea what to do next. "Is there someone who might assist me with this?" Elara asked the general air around her, looking up and down the street. She was not accustomed to asking for help. It was one of the things Thomas had always teased her about gently, that she would struggle with a jar lid until her palm turned red before she would hand it across the table to him. But the trunk was beyond her, and the sky was getting darker by the second. Most of the people on the street were already moving with purpose into doorways, under awnings, back toward whatever shelter they had come from. A man in a black coat hurried past without making eye contact. A woman with 2 small children pressed them both through a shop door and pulled it shut behind her. Nobody stopped. Elara looked at the trunk. She looked at the sky. She pressed her lips together and bent down and grabbed one of the leather handles and pulled, and the trunk moved approximately 3 inches along the boardwalk before she had to stop and straighten up and press her hand to the small of her back. That was when she heard the boots. Not hurried boots, not the scrambling boots of someone running for cover. These were boots with a deliberate stride, the kind of footfall that belonged to someone who was not in any particular rush, even though the whole world around them was. She looked up, and there he was. He was tall in the way that men who spent most of their lives on horseback were sometimes tall wide in the shoulder, long in the leg, with a kind of easy authority in the way he held himself that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with simply having spent years in wide open spaces where there was no one to impress. He was wearing a dark brown canvas coat that had seen considerable weather, worn trousers tucked into boots that were caked with dry red clay, and a hat that sat low over his face. His jaw carried 3 days of dark stubble, and his eyes, when they settled on her and then on the trunk, were a complicated shade of gray-green that Elara would spend a great deal of time thinking about later. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not pause to consider the situation. He simply walked up to the trunk, bent his knees, gripped both handles with his bare hands and lifted it with a grunt and a long exhale, settling it against his chest and stomach in the way that men carry things that are genuinely heavy, using the whole body and not just the arms. "Where to?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste words. Elara blinked. "I beg your pardon. Where are you headed? This thing needs to get inside somewhere before that sky lets go." He glanced up briefly at the rolling black clouds, then back at her, with an expression that was patient but also clearly practical. The first fat drops of rain were already beginning to fall, hitting the dusty street with small dark explosions. "Thomas Voss's property," she said. "I am told it is on Pecan Street, 3 blocks from the main road." Something shifted in his face. It was very subtle, just a slight tightening around the eyes. "I know the house," he said, and began walking. She had to move quickly to keep up with him, gathering her skirts in one hand and reaching for the carpetbag the station boy had left leaning against a post. The boy grabbed the small cart with her 2 traveling cases and fell in behind her, and they moved as a small, odd procession down the main street of Caldwell, while the storm rolled in overhead like something alive and angry. The rain came for real when they were halfway down the second block. It came all at once, the way prairie storms often did, without any gradual buildup. One moment it was a few drops, and then the sky simply opened and poured. Elara gasped and put her free hand over her head uselessly, and the station boy yelped and nearly lost control of the cart on the suddenly slick mud of the unpaved side street. But the man with the trunk kept walking at exactly the same pace he had been walking before, head slightly down against the rain, the enormous trunk held against his chest, water running off the brim of his hat in a steady stream. By the time they reached the small whitewashed house on Pecan Street, Elara was soaked through. Her hair had come down on one side, dark with rain and plastered to her neck. Her good traveling dress was clinging to her in ways that would have embarrassed her in other circumstances, but she was too busy fumbling with the key that Thomas's lawyer had sent her to be embarrassed. She got the door open, and the man carried the trunk inside without being told where to put it, setting it down in the small entry hall with the careful deliberateness of someone placing a thing of value, not just dropping a burden. He straightened up, breathing harder now from the effort, and pushed the wet brim of his hat up with 2 fingers. Water was running down his face and dripping from the collar of his coat. He looked around the dim interior of the house briefly. It was furnished sparsely, dusty from months of sitting empty, and then he looked at her. "You're Thomas Voss's widow," he said. It was not quite a question. "Elara Voss," she said. "Yes." She was still holding the key in one hand and the carpetbag in the other. The rain was roaring on the roof overhead. "And you are Callum Reid," he said. "I worked for your husband." "Or I worked for the man who had the contract on his land before he bought it. Ended up working the northern fence line most of last fall." He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss." He said it simply, without the elaborate sympathy that people had been performing at her since Thomas died, the sorrowful tilted heads, the lowered voices, the hands clasped together as if she were a china cup that might shatter. He just said it plainly, as a fact of the situation, and somehow that was more bearable than all the performances had been. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The station boy had parked the cart on the porch and was already retreating back toward the main street at a run, pulling his collar up against the rain. Elara moved to the door and called out a thank you, and then turned back to find Callum Reid standing with his hat in his hands, looking as if he was debating whether to leave. "You'll wait out the worst of it, I hope," she said, though she had not quite decided to say it before it came out. "I cannot in good conscience send you back out into that." He looked at the window, where the rain was hitting so hard it had turned the glass opaque with white noise. "It'll ease up," he said, which was true. Prairie storms usually did, but he did not move toward the door. "Please," Elara said. "There is a wood stove. I can manage a fire, and I believe there is coffee somewhere in these provisions." She gestured toward the small box of supplies she had arranged to have placed in the house before her arrival, courtesy of the same lawyer who had sent the key. "It is the very least I can offer someone who just carried my trunk 3 blocks in a rainstorm without being asked." The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "All right," he said. She built the fire herself, which she could tell mildly surprised him, though he said nothing. She had grown up in a house in Missouri that was more practical than elegant, and her mother had believed firmly that every woman ought to know how to lay a fire, preserve food, and read a bank statement. She got the wood stove going on the second attempt, found the coffee tin and the small pot in the provision box, and filled it from the hand pump at the kitchen sink that, miraculously, still worked. While the coffee heated, they sat on opposite sides of the small kitchen table and the storm raged outside, and she learned things about Callum Reid the way you learn things about people when there is nowhere else to be and nothing else to fill the silence with. He was 28 years old. He had grown up in Texas, the son of a rancher who had died when Callum was 17, leaving him with a younger sister to look after and not much else. He had spent the better part of a decade doing contract work, fencing, cattle drives, some trail clearing for the railroad in the early 70s, moving from job to job the way a lot of men did in Kansas in those years, following the work wherever it led. He had been in Caldwell for about 8 months now, working primarily for a larger cattle operation called the Harmon Ranch on the eastern edge of town. He lived in the bunkhouse there, which was, he said, sufficient. He did not say any of this like a man reciting his credentials. He said it in short, direct sentences with comfortable pauses between them, and he asked her questions too, where she had come from, why she had decided to come west instead of staying in St. Louis, what she intended to do with the house and the land. Nobody had asked her that last part yet. Thomas's lawyer had asked her what she intended to do with the estate, which was different, being about legal arrangements and paperwork. But Callum asked what she intended to do with the house, which was about living in it, which was a different question entirely. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I need to see it in better light than this before I can answer that." He nodded as if that was a perfectly reasonable answer. The coffee was strong and slightly burnt, but warm, and they held their cups and listened to the storm run its course above them. Elara found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not anxious in his presence. She had been anxious for most of the last 4 months, ever since Thomas's sudden death from a fever that came on fast and left no room for preparation. She had been anxious packing up the apartment in St. Louis, anxious on the train, anxious on the stagecoach, arriving alone in a town she had never visited to claim a life she had not been given enough time to build. But in this small, dim kitchen with the rain on the roof and the wood stove ticking with heat, she felt something she had almost forgotten the name of, steady. She did not examine that feeling too closely. She simply allowed it to be there. When the storm finally eased, Callum Reid set down his empty cup, stood, and put his hat back on. The light coming through the window had shifted to the gold gray of late afternoon, and the rain had pulled back to a fine mist. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "Thank you for the trunk," she said. He nodded once and went to the door, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him step off the porch onto the wet grass. He had nearly reached the gate when he turned. "There's a general store on Maple, run by a woman named Clara Fitch," he said. "She's fair and she knows everyone in town. If you need anything or need to find anything, she's the one to ask." Elara smiled. It was the first real smile she had produced in quite a long time, and she could feel it in her face as if it had cost her something and given something back simultaneously. "I will keep that in mind," she said. He turned again and was gone, and she stood in the doorway of Thomas's of her house for a long moment after he had disappeared around the corner, listening to the mist and the drip of water from the roof eaves, before going back inside to begin the work of making herself a life in this place. She went to Clara Fitch's general store the very next morning. Clara was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair coiled severely at the back of her head and eyes like polished dark buttons that did not miss anything. She took one look at Elara coming through the door and said, "You must be Thomas Voss's widow. Welcome to Caldwell. The flour here is better than what Dawson carries and the prices are fairer. What do you need?" Elara liked her immediately and completely. She bought flour, salt, dried beans, a side of cured ham, 2 yards of sturdy cotton, and a box of candles. While Clara wrapped things in brown paper and string, she asked about the property, what the land could realistically support, whether there was someone reliable who could help her assess what repairs the house needed, whether the well on the north side of the property was clean. Clara answered all of her questions with the directness of someone who found small talk inefficient. The land could support a good kitchen garden and possibly a small dairy arrangement if Elara wanted to buy a milk cow. The house was structurally sound, but the roof would need new shingles before winter. The well was clean. Thomas had had it tested the previous fall, which was one of the more sensible things he had apparently done. "You knew him?" Elara asked. "Well enough," Clara said, which was not a ringing endorsement. "He was not a bad man, just not well suited to this kind of life. He had a city imagination." Elara thought about that. Thomas had been a gentle man, bookish, more comfortable with contracts and correspondence than with horses and mud. He had bought the Caldwell property as an investment, something on paper, never having visited it himself. He had planned to come with Elara in the summer of 1878 to see it together, to decide together what to do with it. But the fever had come in January and his plans had ended, as all his plans had ended, unfinished and unmade. "I suppose I have a frontier imagination," Elara said. "I just haven't used it yet." Clara looked at her sharply, and then her face shifted into something warmer. "You might do all right here," she said. Elara walked home carrying her parcels, and she felt again that tentative steadiness. The following weeks were full. She hired 2 men recommended by Clara's husband to assess and repair the roof. She cleared out the house methodically, sorting Thomas's few belongings. He had sent some things ahead in the early winter before he fell sick, and making decisions about what to keep and what to release. She planted a kitchen garden in the dark soil behind the house, which was rich and deep, and clearly had not been worked in years, meaning it had saved up everything it had to give. She saw Callum Reid 3 times in those first weeks. Once on the main street, where he was loading supplies into a wagon, and lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat when he saw her, the way men did who were busy, but did not want to be rude. Once at the feed store, where she had gone to inquire about a milk cow, and he had been there settling an account for the Harmon Ranch, and they had stood side by side at the counter for a few minutes, and he had told her that Gustafson's farm 2 miles east often had dairy stock for sale at reasonable prices. And once at the Sunday service at the small Methodist church near the center of town, where he sat 3 pews behind her, and she was aware of him the whole time in a way that she told herself was simply the natural awareness of seeing a familiar face in an unfamiliar crowd. She thought about that afternoon in the kitchen often. She thought about the way he had carried the trunk without being asked, without any announcement or expectation, simply because it needed to be done, and he was there. She thought about the way he had asked her what she intended to do with the house. She thought about the gray-green of his eyes in the dim light. She told herself firmly that she was grieving, and that grief did peculiar things to a person's mind and heart, that it made you hungry for warmth and connection in ways that could lead you toward very poor decisions if you were not careful. She told herself she was not the kind of woman who tumbled headlong into foolishness just because a man had been kind to her during a storm. She was absolutely correct about all of this, and it made absolutely no difference. In the middle of May, a problem presented itself. The property included a northern parcel of land, about 40 acres of grass and scrub, that Thomas had purchased along with the house. Elara had known about it vaguely from the estate documents, but she had not understood until she walked it in the bright spring sunlight exactly what she had. It was good land. It sloped gently toward a creek line that ran year-round, and the grass was thick and deep-rooted. Clara's husband, who had some experience in land matters, had come out to look at it with her, and told her plainly that if she leased it as grazing land she could generate a reliable income that would keep the house comfortable through several years. The problem was a fence. The northern boundary of her parcel was disputed by a man named Gideon Marsh, who ran a mid-sized cattle operation 2 miles north, and who had, apparently, been using the northern 40 acres as if it were his own for the past 2 years, because Thomas had never been there to challenge him. He had not built any structures on it, but his cattle had grazed it, and he had ideas about it that did not align with the deed of title, which clearly showed the land belonging to the Voss estate and now, therefore, to Elara. She rode out to speak with Marsh herself, which Clara advised against and which she did anyway, because she was not in the habit of letting problems get larger while she waited for them to resolve themselves. Marsh was a heavy, florid man in his mid-50s, with the air of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through sheer persistence. He received her in the yard of his ranch house and listened to what she said with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his eyes doing the slow, dismissive survey that certain men performed on women who had come to discuss business with them. "I've been working that land for 2 years," he said. "A woman on her own doesn't need 40 acres she can't manage." "The deed says otherwise," Elara said pleasantly. "Deeds can be contested," Marsh said. She rode back to town with her jaw set and her mind working. She was not afraid exactly, but she was not naive either. She had learned enough in the weeks since her arrival to understand that in Caldwell in 1878, legal processes moved slowly, and social pressure could accomplish things that paperwork could not. What she needed was to be clearly and visibly in the right, with the land clearly occupied and her claim clearly established. She went to see Mr. Harrington, the town's only lawyer, who confirmed what she already knew. The deed was clear and the land was hers, and Marsh had no legal standing. But Harrington also said, with the careful tone of someone who wanted to be helpful without being specific, that establishing physical presence on the land sooner rather than later would be prudent. She needed that northern fence repaired and extended. She needed cattle on that land or a clear arrangement with someone to lease it before Marsh could make any further claims of established use. She needed help. She went to the Harmon Ranch. She had not planned it that way. She had asked Clara if she knew of reliable fencing men, and Clara had said that the Harmon Ranch sometimes contracted their men out for neighboring property work in the early season, and that she might ask there. And so Elara had ridden out east on the horse she had recently purchased from Gustafson's farm, a steady bay mare named Monday, which she had chosen not for prettiness but for temperament, and she had arrived at the Harmon Ranch headquarters on a Tuesday morning in late May. Callum Reid was in the corral. He was working with a young horse that had not yet decided whether it trusted human beings, moving around the animal in slow circles, speaking quietly in a voice she could not hear from the fence rail. He was not using force or hurry. He simply kept circling and speaking, and after perhaps 10 minutes the young horse stopped bolting away from him and stood still and let him put a hand on its neck. Elara watched the whole thing from the corral fence and did not announce herself until he turned and saw her. He looked startled, which was the first time she had seen anything like that expression on his face. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "I apologize for interrupting," she said. "I came to speak with Mr. Harmon about some fence work, but I was told he is not due back from Wichita until Thursday. I wonder if you might know who I should speak with in his absence." He came to the fence and rested his forearms on the top rail. Up close she noticed again the weathered lines of his face, the way the sun and wind had written years into his skin, and the steadiness of him, that quality she had noticed in the kitchen during the storm, the sense of a person who occupied their own space without apology or excess. He listened while she explained the situation with the northern 40 acres and Gideon Marsh, and his expression did not change much, but the gray-green eyes sharpened slightly. "Marsh is a blowhard," he said when she finished. "He talks big and backs down when he meets a real boundary. You just need the fence. Can you recommend someone reliable? I am prepared to pay a fair rate." He was quiet for a moment, looking past her at something in the middle distance, the way people do when they are making up their minds about something. "I have 3 days clear before the next cattle movement," he said finally. "I could look at it." She should have said something measured and practical like, "Thank you, that is very kind, I will pay you the going rate." Instead she said, "I would be grateful," and he nodded once, and that was that. He came the next day with a post-hole digger, wire, a hammer, and 2 additional men from the ranch who were willing to pick up the work. Elara rode out with them on Monday, carrying a water jug and a basket with bread and hard cheese for the midday meal, because she was not a woman who sat inside while work happened on her own property. They worked for 2 days. It was real, hard, physical labor, digging post holes in clay-heavy soil, stretching wire, hammering staples, keeping the line true across the rolling ground. Elara helped where she could, holding the wire while it was tensioned, passing tools, maintaining a steady supply of water in the punishing May heat. The 2 Harmon Ranch men, a broad-backed Swede named Anders and a quiet young man from Oklahoma named Pete, were polite and uncomplicated and did their work without complaint. Callum worked beside her without treating her like someone who needed to be managed or protected, which she appreciated more than she could easily express. He showed her how to read the tension in the wire before it was secured, how to gauge whether a post was set deep enough to hold against a winter cattle press. He explained things not because he thought she couldn't figure them out eventually, but because knowing them would be useful to her, which was different. On the second afternoon, sitting in the shade of a solitary cottonwood tree near the creek line with the water jug between them and Anders and Pete napping in the grass 20 yards off, he asked her about Germany. She looked at him, surprised. "What about it?" "Your grandmother," he said. "You mentioned the music box when you were telling Mrs. Fitch about your things." He paused. "I wasn't eavesdropping. The store is small," she laughed. It came out of her before she could regulate it, a real laugh, not the polite social variety she had been producing for months. "Bremen," she said. "She came over in the 1830s. She was 16. She came alone." "That takes something," he said. "It does," Elara agreed. She looked at the creek, catching the sunlight. She always said the hardest part was not the crossing or the strangeness of the new place. The hardest part was making the decision to go. Everything after that was just putting one foot in front of the other. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a useful thing to know. Are you thinking of going somewhere?" she asked. He considered this with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to most things. "I've been thinking about land," he said. "I have enough saved that I could file a homestead claim on a parcel east of the creek line, enough to start something of my own." He looked at the grass ahead of them. "It's just a thought." "It sounds like more than a thought," she said. He glanced at her sideways, and there it was again, that almost smile, the thing that lived just at the edge of a full expression. "Maybe," he said. Gideon Marsh came to see the fence on the 3rd day, which was the day it was completed. He rode up on a large gray horse and looked at the new posts and stretched wire with the expression of a man who has found something he cannot argue with legally, but intends to resent permanently. He looked at Elara on her bay mare, and then at Callum standing at the fence line with his hammer still in his hand, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "This isn't finished," Marsh said finally. "The fence is," Elara said. Marsh looked at Callum again, then turned his horse and rode back north without another word. Anders, who had been listening from nearby, said in his measured, accented English, "That is a man who knows when he is lost." Callum drove the last post staple home with 3 clean hammer strikes, and Elara watched his hands and thought about her grandmother crossing the Atlantic at 16 with a music box, and a decision made and one foot following the other. And she thought that there were different kinds of courage, and they did not all announce themselves. She paid Callum and the 2 other men the agreed rate, which Callum tried to refuse by half, and which she insisted on in full, because she was not going to be in debt to anyone's charity, not even someone she paid him the full rate. Summer settled over Caldwell like a warm hand. The town was busy, cattle drives moved through in waves, and the main street filled periodically with drovers and cowboys who were loud and sometimes troublesome, but who mostly kept to themselves after the first night. The cattle trade was the heartbeat of Caldwell in those years, and Elara felt it as a kind of energy in the town, a constant flow of life through a place that might otherwise have been very quiet. Her kitchen garden flourished in the rich soil. She had planted tomatoes, squash, beans, and a row of sunflowers that she had not intended to plant but that had gone in on impulse, because she had found the seeds in a paper envelope in the provision box, and the sight of them had made her feel, unexpectedly, hopeful. She leased the northern 40 acres to a rancher named Sullivan, who ran a small operation and was reliably honest, and delivered her quarterly payments on the first of the month like clockwork, which meant she had an income, and the land was visibly occupied, and Gideon Marsh had nothing further to say about it. She and Callum fell into a habit without either of them quite deciding to. He came to town most Saturday afternoons on his half-day off from the Harmon Ranch, and she was often at Clara's store or in the small library that had been established in a room at the back of the Methodist church, and they would encounter each other and end up walking in the same direction, talking. Sometimes he came for Sunday dinner, which began as a single occasion that Clara Fitch had arranged. Clara was a deliberate woman who saw things clearly and did not leave them unarranged, and which repeated itself with increasing regularity until it simply became a standing thing. Callum Reid at Elara Voss's table every Sunday, both of them pretending this was casual and neither of them quite convinced. She told him about Thomas. Not the grief, she found she could not quite give that to anyone yet, but about Thomas himself, the kind of person he had been, the plans they had made together, the life they had been building before it was taken. She told it steadily, without self-pity, because Thomas deserved to be remembered honestly and not just mourned. Callum listened the way he did everything, with his full attention and without interruption, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like a man who was worth knowing," and she was grateful again for his plainness. He told her about his sister. Her name was Maggie, and she was 22 now and living in Austin, married to a schoolteacher named Daniel Holt, with a baby boy born the previous winter. Callum's face changed when he talked about Maggie, softened in a way that it did not soften for most subjects, and Elara understood that his sister was the center of his history in a way that explained a great deal about him. After their father died, he had worked every job available to keep them fed and housed. He had made sure Maggie could go to school, that she had shoes in winter, that she did not have to carry the weight of their situation before she was old enough. And then when she was settled and safe, he had started moving again, because moving was what he had learned to do. "Do you miss her?" Elara asked one Sunday evening in late June when they were sitting on her porch in the long golden light, the air still warm from the day's heat, the garden visible in rows of deep green. "Every day," he said simply. "You should write to her more," Elara said. He looked at her. "She says the same thing. She's right." He was quiet for a moment, and then, very quietly, he laughed. It was a real laugh, the first she had heard from him, and it was a low, warm sound that she felt somewhere in her chest, and she thought, with sudden alarming clarity, that she was in some very significant trouble. She did not sleep well that night. She was practical about it, in the way she was practical about most things. She sat at the kitchen table the next morning with her coffee and the accounts ledger, and she made herself consider the situation honestly. She had been a widow for 8 months. She had known Callum Reid for 3 of them. He was a kind man, genuinely, consistently kind, not in the performed way that men sometimes were when they wanted something, but in the straightforward way of someone for whom kindness was simply a default position. He was intelligent and capable and funny in a quiet way that required attention to catch. He had good values. She could see it in how he treated the men he worked with, in the way he had spoken about Maggie, in the way he had carried her trunk without fanfare and helped with her fence without condescension. He was also a man who had been moving his whole life and had not yet stopped. A man who spoke about filing a homestead claim as if it were a thought rather than a plan. A man who kept his life in a bunkhouse and his heart, she suspected, equally unburdened. She was not going to make assumptions. She was not going to do anything reckless. She was going to continue being exactly who she was and let things be exactly what they were. This lasted approximately 2 more weeks. It was a Wednesday in mid-July, hot and still, the kind of day that pressed down on you like something physical. She had been in the garden since early morning, and by midday she had come inside to escape the worst of the heat and was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of well water and the surveying maps her father had left her. She had been teaching herself to read them properly, with a book borrowed from the library and a compass she had purchased from Clara's store. She was working through the mathematics of the northern parcel's boundary measurements when she heard boots on the porch. He knocked. He always knocked, which she appreciated, even when she had told him he did not need to. She called for him to come in, and he opened the door and stood in the entry with his hat in his hands, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before. Not uncertainty, exactly, she was not sure she had ever seen him uncertain, but something that had the quality of a decision recently and slightly uncomfortably made. "Do you have a moment?" he said. She set down the compass. "Of course." He came and sat at the table across from her, which he had done many times before, and he looked at the maps for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I filed the homestead claim," he said. She felt a small, involuntary brightening inside her. "You did. 80 acres east of the creek line. The Homestead Act allows it, and the land agent said the paperwork will be clear inside a month." He turned his hat in his hands once. "It's good land. It'll take work." "All good land does," she said. "I've given notice at the Harmon Ranch. I'll finish out the month there, and then I'll start on the homestead." He paused. "I'll need to build a house. There's nothing on it yet." "Where will you stay while you build?" "The land agent said there's a storage structure on the eastern edge I can make use of temporarily. It'll do for the summer." She was quiet, looking at him, and he was looking at her, and the kitchen was very still and very warm. "I wanted you to know," he said. "I'm glad you told me," she said. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said in the same low, direct voice he used for everything, "I wanted you to know because it changes things for me. It means I'm not going anywhere. It means I'm staying." Another pause. "I thought that might be relevant information." The room was completely still. Outside, a bird was making a sound in the cottonwood tree at the side of the house, a repetitive, cheerful noise that was the only sound in the world. "Relevant to what?" Elara said, and her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been thinking about since April, and he said, "To you. If there is any." He stopped, which was unusual because he was not a man who got tangled in his words. He tried again. "I would like to spend more time with you, Elara, more deliberately, if that is something you would want." She had known it was coming, in the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes. She had felt it building for weeks. And still, hearing it said plainly in the bright noonday heat of her kitchen, it hit her with a force that was entirely disproportionate to the calm quiet of the words. "Yes," she said, "it is something I would want." He exhaled. She had not realized he had been holding his breath slightly, but he had, and the exhale was quiet and honest, and it made her feel inexplicably like crying, not from sadness but from some fullness that had no other obvious exit. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat there for a moment in the warm kitchen, and then she offered him coffee, and he accepted, and they spent the next 2 hours going over the surveying maps together. Callum pointing out the creek line on her father's maps and comparing it to his memory of the land he had filed on, talking about water access and soil type and the logistics of building a structure from scratch. And all of it was completely practical, and all of it was also completely suffused with the new thing that had been said between them, the stated wanting, and Elara felt it in every exchange of the compass across the table, in every moment their eyes met over the paper. When he left that evening, he paused on the porch and turned, and he said, "Would you ride out with me on Saturday to see the parcel?" "Yes," she said. He put his hat back on and walked down the porch steps, and she watched him go until he was gone, and then she stood in the doorway in the cooling evening air and felt the whole world rearranged around her, gently, like furniture moved to better catch the light. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear. She wore her most practical riding dress and packed a small saddlebag with bread and cheese and a jar of preserved peaches she had put up earlier in the week from the small peach tree at the back of her lot, and she was at the gate with Monday already saddled when he arrived. He was riding a dark roan horse with a white blaze that she had seen him on before, and that she now knew was named Copperhead, for reasons that Callum had explained had more to do with the horse's early temperament than its coloring. The horse had improved considerably with patience, in the way that many things improved with patience. They rode east out of town in the early morning light, the air still cool and smelling of damp grass, the prairie spreading around them in every direction in that vast, open way that had startled her when she first came west, and that she had since come to feel was not threatening but freeing. The sky was enormous. It was always enormous out here, more sky than anywhere she had ever been, and she had learned to love it. He showed her the land. It was 80 acres of rolling grass and scrub oak, with the creek running along the southern edge in a bright, clear line. The storage structure he had mentioned was a small stone building at the eastern corner, solid-walled, with a sound roof, and Callum had already begun making it habitable with a cot, a small iron stove, and a shelf of provisions. He showed her where he planned to build the house on a slight rise that would catch the prevailing southern wind and give a view of the creek, and where the barn would go, and where, eventually, he thought there might be an orchard. "An orchard," she said, standing on the rise and looking at the flat grass around them. "It takes time," he said, "but the soil is good. It would work." She looked at the land and thought about what it would look like in 10 years' trees, a house, a barn, some cattle, maybe a garden like the one she had started at the Pecan Street house. She could see it very clearly, which surprised her. They ate their midday meal by the creek, sitting on a flat rock that had been warmed by the morning sun, passing the jar of preserved peaches between them. He told her about the houses he had seen built from scratch over the years, the mistakes that were common and how to avoid them. She told him about the kitchen garden and her plan to expand it next spring, and about a letter she had received from a horticultural society in Kansas City asking if she would be willing to correspond about frontier growing conditions. "You should do that," he said immediately. "I wasn't sure it was. You should do that," he said again, more firmly, with the quiet conviction of someone who had been watching her carefully and had formed opinions about what she was capable of. "You're good at things that other people don't think to pay attention to." She looked at him. The sun was full on his face, and his eyes were more green than gray out here in the open air, and he was looking at her with an expression of such clear and uncomplicated regard that she felt it like a hand placed gently over a place she had not realized was still sore. "Callum," she said. "Yes." She was not sure what she intended to say. She was not generally a woman who moved without knowing where she was going, but there was something about this moment, the sun and the creek and the preserved peaches, and the way he had said she was good at things without it being a compliment designed to flatter her, that made the usual careful scaffolding fall away. "I think I am going to be very fond of you," she said, which was an understatement of considerable magnitude, and they both knew it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and picked up her hand from where it rested on the flat rock, very carefully, as if it were something he was not sure he had the right to hold, and held it. Neither of them said anything. The creek ran past them over its stones, and the grass moved in the light wind, and the sky was blue and enormous and full of summer. And she sat beside him with her hand in his and felt something that had been very tightly closed inside her for a long time begin, cautiously, gently, to open. August burned hot and bright, and they saw each other most days. It was not a romance that announced itself loudly. There were no grand gestures, no declarations performed for an audience. It was quiet and consistent and warm, the way a good fire is warm, the kind that does not flare up dramatically but that heats the whole room evenly and does not go out. He came to her house for dinner. She rode out to the homestead parcel and watched the house foundation take shape, stone by stone, Callum working alongside two hired men with the same focused steadiness he brought to everything. She brought lunch and sometimes stayed to help where she could, mixing mortar, passing tools, carrying water, learning the rhythm of physical work done outdoors in the summer heat. It suited her, she found, in a way that nothing in St. Louis ever quite had. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in late August, on her porch, after dinner, in the long purple twilight that Kansas produced in summer like it was showing off. They had been standing at the porch rail looking at the garden in the fading light, talking about something. She could not afterward remember exactly what, some practical matter about the homestead's water arrangement. And then the talking had simply stopped, and he had turned toward her and she had looked up at him, and it had happened simply and quietly and completely, the way the most important things do. He pulled back and looked at her, checking, and she thought that was so entirely characteristic of him that it made her chest ache. "Elara," he said. "Yes," she said, and was not answering a question he had asked but one he was preparing to ask, and he understood that, and he kissed her again. The letter from Maggie arrived in September. It was addressed to Callum, obviously, and he brought it to Sunday dinner and read from it aloud because Maggie, apparently, wrote letters the way other people had conversations, warmly, rapidly, going in several directions at once, and he had been sharing her letters for weeks now. But this one was different. Maggie was coming to Caldwell. Her husband Daniel had been offered a position at the new school in Medicine Lodge, 40 miles west, and they were moving from Austin in October. She wrote that she intended to stop in Caldwell on the journey and see Callum, and also she had clearly been briefed, probably by Callum's infrequent letters, to meet the woman her brother had been spending considerable time with. Callum read this part with his eyes on the page and the color in his face slightly higher than usual, and Elara laughed, which was becoming something she did with increasing frequency and ease. "You told her about me," she said. "Some things," he said. "What things?" He set the letter down and looked at her directly, the way he always did when he was going to say something true. "That you were remarkable," he said. "And that I thought I was in love with you." The kitchen went very quiet. She looked at him across the table with the supper things between them and the September evening light coming through the window, and she thought of the trunk in the rain, the first sight of him, the deliberate, unhurried stride across the boardwalk towards something that needed doing. She thought of the fence posts and the preserved peaches and the flat rock by the creek in his hand holding hers like something fragile and something solid at the same time. "Callum," she said, "I know it's been— I love you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I love you." He was very still for a moment, and then his face did something she had never seen it do, which was open completely, all the usual careful composure gone, and what was underneath it was something raw and warm and certain. He reached across the table, and she took his hand and they held on. Maggie arrived in the second week of October on a clear, cold morning when the cottonwood trees along the creek had gone gold and the prairie grass had turned to copper. She was smaller than Elara had imagined, dark-haired and vivid-eyed and quick in the way that her brother was slow. But underneath the quickness, there was the same steady core that Elara recognized. She had a 10-month-old boy on her hip named James, and a husband who was quiet and good-humored and clearly devoted. And she embraced Callum in the middle of the street, outside the stagecoach stop, with the kind of unself-conscious ferocity that only siblings who have been through difficult things together can manage. Then she turned to Elara and looked at her with Callum's eyes in a different face and said, "He told me you were remarkable, and I can see he was understating things. I'm Maggie." Elara liked her immediately, which was not a surprise, and Maggie liked Elara, which she expressed in the direct way of her family by immediately treating her as if they had known each other for years. They spent 3 days together, Callum showing Daniel around the homestead property, Maggie sitting in Elara's kitchen with baby James on a blanket on the floor between them, talking about Texas and Missouri and what it meant to build a life in a new place. Maggie told her about Callum growing up, the years after their father died, the work he had done, the way he had been so careful with everything, and so careful never to show how much the care cost him. She said it not as a criticism, but as the record of a person she knew completely and loved completely and wanted someone else to understand. "He has never asked anyone for anything," Maggie said quietly, watching James bat at a wooden spoon on the blanket. "Not ever. Since Papa died he has just given, to me, to whatever work he was doing, to whoever needed something, and he never complained and never expected anything back." "He carried my trunk," Elara said, and Maggie looked at her. "The first day I arrived, he just did it, didn't ask, didn't make a thing of it, just picked it up and walked." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "That is exactly him," she said. "I know," Elara said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and something passed between them that was the beginning of a real friendship, the kind built on shared knowledge of a specific person and what it means to love them. On the last evening of their visit after dinner, after Daniel had taken the baby upstairs to the room Elara had prepared and Maggie had excused herself to help, Elara and Callum were alone on the porch in the cold October dark, wrapped in separate coats, the stars very bright overhead in the way they were only in places far from cities. "She loves you very much," Elara said. "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "She likes you." "I like her." He turned toward her. In the dark his face was mostly shadow and the pale light of the stars, and she could see the outline of him and the shape of the decision she could feel building. She had been feeling it for weeks now, since September in the kitchen, since his face had opened like that, since she had said the thing out loud and heard the silence after it change quality completely. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. He took a breath. "I want to marry you, Elara. I want to spend my life on that land with you, and I want to do it properly. I am not a man with much. The homestead is only beginning and I have savings but not wealth, and what I can offer you now is mostly work and intention and the absolute certainty that I will spend every day trying to deserve your good opinion." He paused. "But I want to ask, will you marry me?" The stars were very bright. The October air was cold and clean. Somewhere across the field an owl called once and went quiet. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He laughed, that real laugh, the warm, low sound she had been collecting since June, and he put his arm around her and pulled her into the side of him, and she leaned into his warmth and felt the cold night air against her face and thought about her grandmother at 16 on a ship in the Atlantic with a wooden music box and a decision, and about the difference between the life you imagine and the life you find, which is sometimes wider and stranger and more beautiful than any imagined version could have been. They were married in the Methodist Church in Caldwell on a Saturday in November 1878, with Clara and her husband standing as witnesses and Maggie holding baby James in the second pew and half the town in attendance, because Clara Fitch had told several people, and Clara Fitch's social reach was considerable. The minister was a round-faced man named Reverend Alcott, who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and spoke briefly about the courage of building something new in a new place, which was the most appropriate sermon he could have given for this particular wedding, and which made Elara press her lips together against a feeling she did not want to release in public. Callum in clean clothes and a good coat looked, she thought, exactly like himself, which was all she wanted. She wore her grandmother's locket at her throat, small gold, with a painted miniature inside that had gone slightly blurry with age, but that she had always known was a woman with a firm expression and considerable amounts of dark hair. She wore the best of her 3 fine dresses, the dark blue one, and carried a small bunch of late-season flowers that Clara had arranged from dried herbs and the last of the garden. When the Reverend asked and Callum answered, his voice was steady and low and completely certain, and she felt the certainty of it like a handhold in rough water. After the ceremony, the town produced a celebration in the way frontier towns did, quickly, generously, with whatever was available. Clara had organized it while apparently doing something else. There was food from half a dozen households, a fiddle player from the saloon who was entirely willing to play wedding music for an afternoon, and a great deal of very earnest dancing in the cleared space behind the church. Callum was not, he admitted under questioning, a particularly skilled dancer, but he was a willing one, and they danced badly and happily together while Maggie clapped and Daniel laughed and baby James slept through everything with the untroubled peace of an infant. That evening, after Maggie and Daniel and the baby had retired to the hotel on the main street, because Elara had firmly and cheerfully insisted on this, Elara and Callum came home to the Pecan Street house, which was now theirs together. She had lit a fire in the wood stove before the ceremony, so the house was warm when they arrived, and the music box from Bremen was on the parlor shelf, and her father's maps were rolled neatly in the corner, and the kitchen smelled of dried herbs from the garden. He stood in the entry hall for a moment, looking at the house, and she understood that he was doing something he had probably not done in a very long time, which was allowing himself to be simply home. She took his hand and led him into the warm parlor and wound up the music box, and the small clear notes spilled into the quiet room, and she stood in the lamplight while the November wind moved outside and felt, completely and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They spent that winter building. Not just the homestead house, though the walls went up through November and December in the bright cold, stone and timber, Callum working with his hired men on the days the weather permitted, and with his own hands on the days it did not. They built the marriage too, which required different materials and different tools but similar patience. They learned each other in the dailiness of shared life, how she was sharpest in the morning and how he did not speak much before coffee, how she read in the evenings, and he often sat near her and whittled small things out of scraps of wood, how they managed disagreements, of which there were some, by speaking about them directly and without drama, which was their combined natural inclination. She continued corresponding with the Horticultural Society in Kansas City, and her letters were published in their quarterly journal that winter, and she received 3 responses from other women farming in frontier conditions who had found her observations useful. This pleased her deeply, in a quiet, private way. He wrote to Maggie more regularly, as Elara had suggested, and Maggie's responses became longer and more frequent, and sometimes he read aloud from them at the supper table, and she could hear Maggie's rapid, warm voice in the words and felt glad of her as a person in the world. In February of 1879, she realized she was expecting. She told Callum on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the winter light coming cold and clear through the window, and he put his coffee cup down very carefully and looked at her and did not say anything for a moment, which was unusual. "Are you?" she began. "Elara," he said. And then, in a voice that was not his usual composed voice but something rougher and younger and entirely unguarded, he said, "I am so, I don't have a word for this." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Happy," she suggested. "Overwhelmingly," he said, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, and she squeezed his hand and they sat in the winter morning light and did not need any other words. He was careful with her through the winter and spring in a way that was attentive without being suffocating, because he understood her well enough by now to know that being treated as fragile would drive her considerably more distracted than any physical discomfort. He simply paid attention. He noticed when she was tired and made it possible for her to rest without making it an instruction. He moved things she should not be lifting before she reached for them. He learned to cook 3 meals that were edible, which was not his previous area of competence, and produced them without ceremony. She moved the music box to the bedroom shelf, where it could be wound in the evenings, and sometimes in the early spring, with the window open and the smell of new grass coming in on the air, she would lie in the dark and listen to its small clear notes and think about continuity, about things that were carried from one place to another across great distances, about what persists. The homestead house was completed in April of 1879, and they moved the bulk of their lives out to it on a clear spring morning with Clara's husband and 2 of the ranch hands helping. They kept the Pecan Street house, which they leased out to a young schoolteacher newly arrived from Ohio and her husband, because the income was useful, and Elara had a sentimental attachment to the building that she did not feel the need to apologize for. The new house was simple and strong and set on the rise above the creek exactly where Callum had planned it, with windows on 3 sides and a porch running along the south face and a root cellar dug into the slope below. Elara planted the kitchen garden within a week of moving in the rich soil of the homestead, and the sunflowers went in on impulse again, same as the year before, because they had come to be something she associated with persistence and warmth. In June of 1879, on a morning when the prairie grass was deep green, and the creek was running high from the spring rains, and the sunflowers in the garden had not yet opened but were on the verge, Elara gave birth to a son. He was born in the bedroom of the homestead house with the help of the town's doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Halstead, who had been practicing in Caldwell for 4 years and who was brisk and competent, and whom Elara trusted completely. It was not an easy birth, long and exhausting in the way first births often are, and by the end of it she had no strength left for anything except holding the baby against her chest and looking at him. He was small and red and absolutely serious looking. He had Callum's gray-green eyes, or would have them eventually. Eyes were not certain in newborns, Dr. Halstead said, but these ones had that look from the start. Callum sat beside the bed and held her hand and looked at the baby with an expression that was beyond his usual vocabulary of expression, something completely new and unguarded and enormous. "What are we calling him?" she asked, because they had discussed names and made lists and debated and had not quite settled. "Henry," Callum said, which was not quite what they had decided. They had been leaning toward William, but when he said it she thought immediately of his father, whose name she did not know, whom she had never asked about, who had died when Callum was 17 and whose absence had defined a decade of her husband's life. "Was that your father's name?" she asked. He looked at her. "No, my father was Robert," a pause, "but I thought Henry was my grandfather on my mother's side. He was a good man from what I was told." Another pause. "I just thought it suited him." "Henry Reid," she said, looking at the small, serious face. "Yes, it suits him." Clara Fitch came the following morning with food enough for a week and sat in the kitchen, and held Henry with the experienced ease of a woman who had raised 4 of her own children and was entirely unbothered by small demanding persons, and told Elara firmly that she was not to get out of bed for 3 days. And also, incidentally, that the letters Elara had been publishing in the Horticultural Journal had been mentioned in the Caldwell Post, which was the town's newspaper. "Have they?" Elara said from the bed. "You're becoming someone people know about," Clara said. "I thought you should know that." Elara looked at the ceiling of her house, the clean planed timber boards of the bedroom ceiling that Callum had fitted himself with evident care, and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that was being built, plank by plank, in the place where it was supposed to be built. She wrote back to the Horticultural Society that autumn with a detailed account of the first growing season at the homestead, including soil composition, water access, what had flourished and what had struggled, and the particular challenges and advantages of the Kansas microclimate she had been farming. They published it in full and asked for more. She became, over the following years, a regular correspondent, and her accumulated letters formed a practical guide that was eventually compiled and distributed, though that is a later chapter of a story that was still only beginning. In the winter of 1879, a letter arrived from Wichita. It was addressed to Callum and had the look of official correspondence. He opened it at the kitchen table in the evening with Henry asleep in the small room next door. They had converted the house's second room into a nursery, and Callum had built a crib from cottonwood planks that was sturdy and slightly lopsided and entirely functional, and read it through twice without saying anything. Elara waited. "It's from the county land office," he said. "The parcel adjacent to the northern boundary, the 30 acres on the eastern side of the creek. The family that had it has relinquished the claim. It's available." She understood immediately what he was asking without him asking it. They looked at each other across the table. "Can we manage the additional payment?" she said. "The northern 40 has been leasing well," he said. "Between that and what I'm running on the homestead acres, I think we can file on it." "Then file on it," she said. He did in February of 1880, and the 30 acres came into their holding and changed the shape of the land they were building on, extending it along the Eastern Creek line in a way that opened up possibilities he had been turning over quietly for months. He began talking, that spring, about cattle of their own, not a large operation, nothing like the Harmon Ranch, but a modest beginning, a small herd that could grow over years with careful management. Elara, for her part, had begun corresponding with a woman in Lawrence, Kansas, who was establishing a seed exchange network, connecting women farmers across the state who were developing and sharing varieties suited to frontier conditions. She became part of that network, contributing seeds from her own garden and receiving others, building a collection of varieties that she tracked in a dedicated ledger with notes on growing conditions and yield. It was meticulous, absorbing work, and it connected her to women across the state in a way that enriched the isolation of homestead life considerably. The injustice of those years was always present at the edges of everything, and Elara saw it clearly. She saw it in the way the land had been taken from the people who had known it longest. The Kansas, the Wichita, the Comanche, pushed steadily westward and onto reservations by treaty after broken treaty, their lives reduced and constrained by forces they had not been able to stop. She had read enough and listened enough to understand that the land she and Callum were building on had a history that preceded their claim on it by centuries, that the rich soil and the clear creek and the wide sky had been home to people whose names she did not know, and whose losses she could not adequately comprehend. She spoke of this to Callum, and he agreed without defensiveness, because he was the kind of man who could hold uncomfortable truths without needing to deflect them. It did not undo what they were building, but it added to it a weight of responsibility and awareness that she thought mattered. She was also acutely aware of what it meant to be a woman with property in 1879 and 1880. The legal protections for women's land ownership in Kansas were somewhat better than in some eastern states, but they were not complete, and she had watched women in town lose control of property through marriage or through the simple social assumption that a woman's holdings were managed by the nearest male relative. She kept her own accounts in her own ledger. She attended every meeting at the county land office that was relevant to their holdings. She knew the law as it applied to her situation as precisely as Harrington, the lawyer, did, and she made sure Harrington knew she knew it. Callum found this not threatening but admirable. She had known he would, from the way he had always spoken of Maggie, as someone capable and complete, whose capacity for managing her own life was a thing to appreciate and not to minimize. It was one of the things she loved about him most, that he had learned in a difficult school to see women as full persons. In the spring of 1881, Maggie wrote with news. She and Daniel were settled in Medicine Lodge, and thriving James was walking and talking with considerable enthusiasm, and there was a second child coming in the autumn. She wanted to visit in the summer, and could she bring a friend, a woman named Helen who had come to Medicine Lodge from Ohio and who was, Maggie said, sharp as a tack and lonesome as anything. They came in July, Maggie with James, now 2 years old and in constant purposeful motion, and Helen, who was 26 and bookish and had a way of laughing at things that other people did not think were funny, which Elara found delightful. Daniel remained in Medicine Lodge, unable to leave the school, but sent his love and a crate of preserved pears. Henry, who was 2 years old that summer and had grown into a person of considerable character, serious like his father, curious like his mother, with gray-green eyes that had settled into their final color, and James spent the visit in the way that small children who are exactly the right age apart spend time together, which is in a constant companionable state of parallel play punctuated by occasional shared disasters. Elara and Maggie and Helen sat on the porch in the summer evenings after the children were in bed and talked about everything: books, farming, politics, the state of things for women in Kansas, what they hoped for. It was one of those evenings, the air soft and warm, the creek audible in the quiet, the stars beginning to come out, when Callum came in from the day's work and sat on the porch steps and listened to them talk with the comfortable ease of a man who was entirely secure in his own household. And Elara looked at him and felt the full weight of everything they had built together. The land and the house and Henry asleep inside, and this porch and this evening, and she thought, this is the thing. Not the house or the land or even the love itself, but the continuous daily practice of it, the living of it, the way it accumulated into something solid enough to sit on. He caught her looking, and the ghost of the smile, the almost smile she had been cataloging since the first day on the boardwalk in the rain, was fully present this time, warm and unhurried and just for her. She reached over from her chair and took his hand where it rested on the porch railing, and he turned his palm up and held on, and the conversation continued around them, and the stars came out one by one, and the creek ran in the dark below the rise. In October of 1881, their second child arrived. This one came faster than Henry had. Dr. Halstead arrived with an hour to spare, which she said was entirely normal for second children and entirely inconvenient for everyone, and was a daughter. She was born squalling loudly, which Henry had not done, and which Callum said with quiet certainty was going to be the defining characteristic of her personality. He was not wrong. They named her Clara after Clara Fitch, which they had arranged in advance and which Clara herself had been informed of only after the fact. Clara Fitch received this information at the kitchen table of her store with the expression of someone who was deeply moved and had no intention of showing it, and then cleared her throat and said, "Well, I hope she's stubborn." "She is," Callum said, "magnificently." Baby Clara was small and dark-haired and had Elara's eyes dark brown, direct, rarely content to look at one thing for long, and from the first days of her life she had an air of energetic intention that made Henry, at 2.5, regard her with the mixture of interest and wariness that older siblings often develop when they realize the new arrival is going to change things considerably. The homestead in the autumn of 1881 was a working place, full of the evidence of accumulated labor and care. The cattle herd Callum had begun building numbered 32 head, not large but well-selected and healthy. The garden had been expanded twice from Elara's original plot, and now supplied them through most of the winter with stored vegetables and preserved goods. The orchard Callum had spoken of on that first visit to the land, the thought more than a plan, the plan that had become an intention, had been planted 2 years earlier, 12 young trees along the eastern slope, apple and pear and a single peach, and though they had not yet fruited properly, they were growing steadily in the good Kansas soil. Elara's contributions to the Horticultural Journal had been running for 3 years now, and she had received correspondence from women in Colorado, Nebraska, and Missouri, who had found her accounts useful in their own farming decisions. There was talk of a gathering in Wichita the following spring, a meeting of women involved in frontier agriculture, and she was determined to attend and to bring what she had learned. She and Callum had disagreed once, seriously, in those 3 years. It had been about money, specifically, about a tempting but risky arrangement with a cattle broker from Abilene that Callum had been inclined toward, and Elara had seen problems in. She had laid out her concerns in the direct way she brought to everything, and he had listened and argued back and then listened again, and in the end they had not taken the Abilene arrangement. And when the broker's operation had collapsed the following spring with several creditors left unpaid, neither of them mentioned it because neither of them was the kind of person who needed to be told they were right. He trusted her judgment. She trusted his. They had different strengths and they used them, and when they disagreed they said so, and they worked it out, and they went on. It was not a perfect arrangement, because no arrangement between two actual people ever is. But it was a good one, grounded in the kind of mutual respect that grows from genuinely knowing someone. In the spring of 1882, Elara went to the gathering in Wichita. She rode the train. The railroad had expanded considerably, and the journey was half a day with Clara Fitch, who had decided to come along because she was Clara Fitch and she went where she found it useful to go. They spent 3 days in Wichita at the meeting, which was held in a large church hall and attended by 67 women from across the region. And Elara spoke on the second day about water management in frontier garden conditions, using detailed figures from her own 6 years of records, and the room was completely silent while she spoke, and then quite loud afterward. She came home on the 3rd day sunburned and tired and full of ideas, and she told Callum about all of it at dinner, while Henry asked questions about the train, and Clara played on the kitchen floor with a wooden horse Callum had made her. And the stove ticked with warmth, and the April evening light came long through the south-facing windows. After the children were in bed, she and Callum sat together on the porch in the cool spring dark, her feet tucked up under her in the chair, a shawl around her shoulders, and she told him the rest of it, not the public speaking but the private conversations, the things the women at the gathering had said about their circumstances, the difficulties and the inventions and the ways they had found to make things work in conditions that were not designed with them in mind. He listened to all of it. He asked questions that were good questions, the kind that opened things up rather than closing them down. When she said she wanted to write it all up formally and submit it not just to the Horticultural Journal but to the County Agricultural Committee, whose recommendations actually influence policy, he said, "Yes, do that. I'll help with the data compilation if you need it." She looked at him in the dark, the faint starlight on his face. Older now than when she had first seen him on the boardwalk. 46 months had moved through them. 4 winters, 4 springs, 2 children, 30 new acres, an orchard growing, and she thought about the trunk. She thought about it all the time in the background of things, the way you think about the origin of something when you are living inside its consequence. The moment on the boardwalk in the storm when he had simply picked it up and walked, without being asked, without performance, because it needed doing and he was there and that was sufficient reason. She had never told him that she thought about it. She told him now. "Do you know," she said, "that I have thought about that first day more times than I can count." He was quiet in the way that meant he was paying full attention. "You carried my trunk through the storm," she said. "You did not ask if I needed help or tell me you were going to help or make anything of it afterward. You just did it." "The trunk needed carrying," he said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly the thing. You weren't performing anything. You just saw what was needed and did it." He was quiet again. The spring peepers were singing somewhere down by the creek, the first of the season. "I noticed you," he said after a moment, "before the trunk. You were standing there looking at the sky and your face you were not afraid of it. You were just watching it, deciding what to do. And I thought," he stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought you were someone worth knowing," he said. "And then the trunk needed carrying so." She laughed that real laugh, the one that had come back to her in full since the storm and the fence and the preserved peaches and all the rest of it, and he smiled, the full smile now, the one she had worked to earn and kept earning every day. She reached across the arm of her chair and he reached across the arm of his, and their fingers found each other in the spring dark, and she held on, and he held on, and the peepers sang by the creek, and somewhere in the house Henry turned in his sleep and Clara made a small sound and was quiet, and the young trees on the eastern slope were putting out their first serious buds, and the land was good. It was still good in the years that came after the dry summer of 1883 that tested every farmer in the county, and that Elara navigated with her stored water data and her network of contacts, and a stubbornness that Callum said, approvingly, was magnificent. The winter of 1884, when the cattle prices dropped and they tightened everything and came through with the herd intact. The spring of 1885, when the apple trees on the eastern slope produced their first real fruit, and Henry, who was 6, ate so many apples in a single afternoon that he was quite comprehensively sick, which served as both a lesson and a family story that was told for many years afterward. Maggie and Daniel came every summer, and James and Henry grew up as close as brothers across the 40 miles between Caldwell and Medicine Lodge, and little Clara worshipped James with an intensity that amused everyone, and that James, being 8 years older, managed with considerable graciousness. Helen, from the original Wichita visit, remained a friend and correspondent and came twice more to the homestead, once bringing a young man she was considering marrying, and who Elara and Callum assessed carefully and separately and agreed was sound. Clara Fitch got older and handed her store to her second son, but remained the person Elara went to when she needed to think something through, and they had long kitchen conversations about the state of Caldwell and the state of Kansas and the state of the world that lasted through several pots of coffee, and always ended with both of them feeling considerably better equipped for things. Callum filed his report with the County Agricultural Committee in the spring of 1883, compiling 3 years of Elara's data with his own records on cattle and pasture management, and it was received and cited in the following year's County Agricultural Report, which did not change everything, but changed some things for farmers in the region, which was something, which was enough. He had learned, over the years of the homestead, that building something real required accepting its pace, which was not always the pace you wanted. He had learned it from the land and from the cattle and from the orchard, and he had learned it also from Elara, who was faster than him at certain things and slower at others, and who was always, absolutely, worth whatever patience the situation required. On an evening in the autumn of 1885, when Henry was 6 and Clara was almost 4, and the orchard had produced its second good harvest, and the homestead herd had grown to 60 head, Callum came in from the eastern pasture at dusk with something in his coat pocket. He sat down at the kitchen table across from Elara, who was writing up her autumn garden notes in the ledger by lamplight, and she looked up at his expression. "What?" she said. He put the thing from his pocket on the table between them. It was a small, smooth river stone, pale gray, unremarkable, except that he was putting it on the table with the careful deliberateness with which he placed things of value. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I found it by the creek today," he said, "near where we sat that first time you came to look at the land. He paused. "I wanted to give you something, and I don't have anything that was worth giving, and then I found that." She picked it up. It was cool and smooth in her palm, worn to perfect roundness by the creek. "It is absolutely worth giving," she said. He looked at her across the lamplight with 7 years of accumulated days in his face, and she looked at him, and the stone was cool and smooth in her hand, and outside the window the stars were coming up over the prairie in the vast, unhurried way they always did, and the house was warm, and the children were asleep, and the orchard was putting down its roots in the eastern slope, and the creek was running in the dark below the rise, and everything was. As she turned the stone in her fingers and looked at the man across the table who had carried her trunk through a storm, without being asked, and who had stayed, and built, and stayed, everything was exactly as it should be. She set the stone on the windowsill beside the lamp, where the light came through it in the evenings and made it glow. It was still there in the morning. It was still there in the morning of every morning that came after, and there were many mornings, good mornings, full of the ordinary and extraordinary substance of a life built deliberately in a wide place with deep soil and a clear creek, and a sky large enough to hold everything. She never forgot the day of the storm, not once in all those mornings. She never forgot the deliberate stride across the boardwalk, the trunk lifted without ceremony, the low voice asking where to. She had thought of it as kindness the first time. She had thought of it as more than that as she grew to know him. Now she thought of it as a kind of beginning that was also, somehow, already a kind of promise, the first line of something written in plain language, without decoration, that meant exactly what it said. He carried it because it needed carrying. He stayed because it was right to stay. He loved her the same way he did everything, steadily, completely, without excess and without withholding, with the whole of what he had. She had always known how to put one foot in front of the other, even when she did not know where the path led. She had not expected to find, at the end of one particular rainy street in Kansas, that the path led here. She was grateful, every morning, in the particular way you are grateful for things that changed everything, quietly, deeply, with the full weight of knowing what it means.